Most mornings blurred into each other. The shrill cry of the alarm clock, my wife stirring beside me, and the sound of our son babbling from his crib marked the start of every day. It was a life I didn't particularly dream of, but after our child was born, it felt like I'd finally found something worth waking up for. Even the grueling hours at my desk, trapped beneath fluorescent lights and piles of unfinished reports, seemed tolerable. Not because I loved the job, I hated it, but because I knew I was working towards something bigger, our family. After all, wasn't that what fathers were supposed to do? Provide, endure, and come home to be greeted by the giggles of a child and the warmth of a wife who had always been, to me, perfect. My wife was everything, effortlessly beautiful, caring, and kind in ways that made me wonder how I ever got lucky enough to have her. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was ours. The tight hugs from my son, the shared glances with my wife over the dinner table, the bedtime stories I read each night. Those were my anchors. The job didn't matter. The sacrifices didn't matter. As long as they were happy, I was happy. Then, there were days like today. At work, the boss was on my back again, barking orders over the cubicles, turning the office into his personal battlefield. I was used to his shouting. It was routine. I never fought back. What was the point? He screamed at all of us like we were nothing. And in time, I became numb to it. I was playing a role just like everyone else, biding my hours until I could clock out and head back to where my real life was with my family. But today dragged. Endless assignments and backlog paperwork kept me tied to my desk well past closing time. As I gathered my things to leave, I overheard two coworkers whispering inside the boss's office. I wasn't paying attention at first, too focused on getting out. But then, one of their hushed words caught my ear. "I feel sorry for him. That's probably not even his kid." I stopped mid-step. The words sliced through the haze of exhaustion, jolting me awake in a way no amount of coffee ever could. I stood there, frozen by disbelief. Surely they weren't talking about me, right? The conversation continued, low murmurs under the office hum. "You remember, don't you? His wife had a lover 2 years ago. The guy ran off as soon as she got pregnant. It's been the office secret ever since." My breath hitched in my throat. I should have barged in right then, demanded to know what the hell they were talking about, but instead, I stayed hidden in the hallway. My hands clenched around the strap of my bag, so hard that my knuckles turned white. They knew. Everyone at work knew. They had been looking at me all this time, at us like a joke. And I'd been walking around clueless, priding myself on being a husband and father, while the woman I cherished might have been hiding something far worse than I ever imagined. When I finally forced my legs to move, I staggered toward the parking lot, each step heavier than the last. My heart was pounding in my ears, my mind racing with every conversation, every shared glance, every moment that could have been a lie. Anger, disbelief, and humiliation churned inside me like a storm I couldn't contain. On the drive home, I could barely think straight. My mind kept circling back to those whispered words. Probably not his kid. What if they were right? What if the boy I had spent the past 2 years raising, the boy who gave meaning to my every sacrifice, wasn't really mine? The questions came fast and relentless. I wanted to pull the car over, scream into the empty night, or go home and demand the truth from my wife. But what if they were wrong? What if this was all some horrible mistake? I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, forcing myself to stay calm. There was no proof, just gossip. And without proof, I had nothing. Accusing her now would only push her away. When I finally parked outside our house, the windows glowed warmly from within, the soft outline of my wife and son moving behind the curtains. I stayed in the car a little longer, watching them from the safety of the dark. For the first time in years, I felt like an outsider looking in, as though the life I thought I knew had shifted just beyond my reach. The boy I adored was still inside. The woman I loved was still waiting for me. But everything felt different now, brittle like glass already cracked under the surface. When I stepped through the door, she greeted me with her usual smile, but I couldn't return it. Not fully. Not tonight. I kissed my son goodnight, told him a story about brave knights and dragons, and tucked him in like I always did. But every word, Every gesture felt hollow, weighed down by doubt. When I finally slipped into bed beside my wife, her body felt warm against mine, but it offered no comfort. For the first time since we were married, I didn't hold her close. I lay awake long after she drifted off to sleep, my thoughts circling endlessly. The doubts gnawed at me, unraveling every happy memory, every joyful moment, until all I had left were questions. By morning, I knew what I had to do. Morning brought no relief from the storm brewing inside me. As my wife stirred awake, stretching under the covers, I kept my eyes on the ceiling, my mind churning. She turned toward me with a soft, sleepy smile, the same smile that used to make everything feel right. But this morning, it looked like a mask, a polished surface covering something rotten beneath. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice still drowsy. I gave a vague grunt in response, careful to keep my face blank. I couldn't let her know what was going on inside my head. Not yet. She thought I was tired, maybe stressed from work. She had no idea that I was drowning in doubts. The idea of confronting her outright gnawed at me, tempting me to demand answers then and there. But the truth was, I was afraid. If the rumors were false, accusing her would shatter the trust we had. If they were true, I wasn't sure I was ready to hear it, not without proof. And so I played along. I kissed her goodbye, just as I did every morning, and watched her slip out of the door, blissfully unaware that everything between us was beginning to fracture. As soon as she was gone, I knew what I had to do. I had seen it once on some late-night crime documentary. DNA tests, the ultimate arbiter of truth. All I needed was something of our child's, his hair, perhaps, and I could confirm whether he was really mine. It felt surreal, almost shameful, to think of going behind her back like this. But what choice did I have? If I confronted her and she lied, I'd never know for sure. The baby monitor was still faintly buzzing from the bedroom. Our son's tiny snores came through in soft, rhythmic patterns that would normally make me smile. This morning, though, they only filled me with dread. I tiptoed into his room, heart racing, terrified that even the smallest noise would wake him. He lay there peacefully, lost in the blissful ignorance of childhood. I leaned over his crib and carefully plucked a few strands of his baby-fine hair from his blanket, praying he wouldn't stir. He didn't. He was just as trusting, just as innocent as I had always imagined. But now, I wasn't sure if he was even mine. Clutching the strands in my hand, I slipped out of his room and made my way to the front door. My wife had left her car keys by the kitchen counter, just like always. Everything was so normal it made me sick. I left the house feeling like a criminal. The trip to the hospital was a blur. I parked far from the entrance, trying to avoid anyone who might recognize me. At the front desk, I tried to act as calm as possible when I asked about DNA testing. The nurse handed me a form with a smile. "Paternity tests usually take about a week," she said without any judgment in her voice. For that, I was grateful. 7 days. That was how long it would take for me to learn the truth. 7 days to find out if my son, the boy I had loved more than anything, was actually mine. 7 days for my world to either return to normal or crumble to pieces. I handed over the hair samples with a shaking hand, filled out the paperwork, and left the hospital in a daze. There was no turning back now. Whatever was coming, I would have to face it. The first day passed slowly, like moving through wet cement. I went through the motions, work, dinner, bedtime stories, but everything felt muted, distant. I kept replaying those whispered words from my coworkers in my head, over and over, until they blurred with every memory I had of my wife. At home, I tried to act normal, but it wasn't easy. Every time she touched me, I felt like I was suffocating. When she smiled at me, it made my skin crawl. I could barely stand to be in the same room with her, but I had to pretend. I couldn't let her know I was suspicious. Not until I had that envelope in my hands. She noticed the change in me, of course. "You've been quiet," she said one night as we sat together on the couch, her feet tucked under her. "Is everything okay?" I forced a smile, but I could feel the lie clinging to my throat. "Just work," I muttered, trying not to meet her eyes. "You know how it is?" She nodded slowly, concern flickering in her gaze, but she didn't press me further. If she suspected anything, she didn't let on. The second night was worse. I lay awake in bed, listening to her breathing beside me, wondering how much of our life had been a lie. Had she ever loved me? Had she planned this betrayal from the start? I found myself staring at her in the dim light, trying to remember the woman I thought I knew. But all I saw now was a stranger, a woman with secrets I hadn't even begun to uncover. In those quiet hours, when the world outside was still and dark, the doubts gnawed at me the hardest. What if the rumors were true? What if I wasn't my son's father? Could I walk away? By the third day, the pressure became unbearable. At work, I found myself glancing at my coworkers, trying to figure out who had been whispering about me. Their faces were masks, neutral, uninterested, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were all laughing behind my back. Every chuckle, every shared glance felt like a knife in my chest. I spent my lunch break in the parking lot, sitting in my car with the windows rolled up, trying to calm the storm inside me. But it was no use. The walls were closing in. The next few days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. My wife continued to act like everything was normal, but I could see the cracks forming in her facade. She knew something was wrong, even if she didn't know what. The tension between us grew with each passing night. We ate in silence, avoided each other's eyes, and tiptoed around the unspoken truth that hung in the air between us like a dark cloud. She asked me again and again if I was okay. I always gave the same answer, just work, but she wasn't buying it anymore. "You can talk to me, you know," she whispered one night as we lay in bed, her hand resting lightly on my arm. I nodded without saying anything, waiting for her to fall asleep so I could slip back into my thoughts. The seventh day came at last, and with it, the envelope. When I saw it sitting on the kitchen counter, my heart seized in my chest. It was just a small, white envelope, ordinary and unassuming, but inside it lay the truth. I stared at it for a long time, my hands trembling. For a moment, I thought about leaving it unopened. Maybe ignorance was better than knowing. Maybe I could pretend that everything was fine and go on living this life, no matter how broken it felt. But then I remembered those whispers. It's probably not his child. The anger came flooding back, sharp and bitter, and I tore open the envelope without another thought. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, printed in stark black letters, was the result. Probability of paternity, 0%. My knees buckled. The world tilted on its axis. He's not mine. All this time, he was never mine. Rage boiled in my chest, hot and uncontrollable. I grabbed the nearest object, the TV remote, and hurled it across the room. It smashed into the brand-new TV, shattering the screen into a spiderweb of cracks. The anger consumed me. I tore through the house, breaking anything I could get my hands on. Dishes shattered, picture frames crashed to the floor, and furniture toppled in my wake. When my wife came home with our son, she stopped dead in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock at the destruction. And when she saw the look on my face, when she saw the truth staring back at her, she knew. She stood frozen in the doorway, clutching our son to her chest. Her eyes scanned the shattered remains of the life we had built together, the broken TV, the overturned furniture, and me, standing in the center of the chaos, breathing heavily, hands clenched at my sides. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was deafening. I could see the confusion and fear swirling in her expression. But beneath all of that, there was something else, something that looked too much like guilt. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "What's going on?" I didn't answer right away. I stood there, trembling with anger, feeling the weight of the truth crushing down on me. My eyes flicked to our son, sitting quietly in her arms, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. For 2 years, I had loved him, cared for him, given everything I had to build a life for him. And now I knew he wasn't mine. "Put him down," I said hoarsely, my voice barely above a whisper. "Please." She hesitated for a second, but the tension in my voice made her comply. She set him gently on the floor, and he waddled off to his toys, oblivious to the emotional earthquake shattering the room around him. When she straightened up, I met her gaze for the first time since she walked in. Her eyes, those same eyes I had fallen in love with, were full of confusion, but also dread. She knew something was coming. She just didn't know what. I held up the envelope, my hand shaking. Do you want to explain this? Her brow furrowed, confusion flashing across her face. What? What is that? I stepped closer, the paper crumpling slightly in my grip. It's the DNA test. 7 days of waiting, 7 days of wondering if the rumors were true. My voice cracked, betraying the deep hurt beneath my anger. 7 days to find out if he's my son. Her face went pale. She reached out instinctively, as if she could take the paper from me and make it disappear. But I pulled it back before she could touch it. Don't, I hissed. Don't you dare. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a brief moment, I saw a panic flicker across her face. I didn't know, she whispered. I swear, I didn't know. You didn't know? I cut her off, my voice rising. Are you seriously going to stand there and lie to me? You slept with someone else. I choked on the words, fury and heartbreak colliding in my chest. And now you're telling me you didn't even think there was a chance. She shook her head frantically, tears spilling down her cheeks. It wasn't like that, she cried. It was just once. A mistake. I didn't know I was pregnant until after he left. Her words felt like a punch to the gut, but I refused to let them knock me down. So you decided to let me raise him. Just like that? I whispered, my voice trembling. You looked me in the eye every day for 2 years knowing that there was a chance he wasn't mine, and you never said a word. She crumbled under the weight of my accusation, her sobs growing louder. I was scared, she whispered, clutching her arms around herself as if trying to hold her body together. I thought if I told you, you'd leave. And I couldn't do that to him. I shook my head in disbelief, bitterness rising in my throat. You couldn't do that to him? I repeated, laughing bitterly. What about me, huh? What about what you did to me? Her tears fell freely now, but I didn't care. I couldn't care. The weight of her betrayal was suffocating, drowning out every other emotion except rage. You stole 2 years from me, I whispered, stepping closer. 2 years of lies. 2 years of loving a child that isn't even mine. Do you have any idea what that feels like? She tried to say something, an apology, an excuse, but I was done listening. I stormed past her, needing to get away before the fury inside me boiled over. She tried to follow me, her voice desperate and pleading. Please, just talk to me, she cried. I didn't mean for this to happen. I spun around, my chest heaving with anger. Stop saying that. I roared. You made a choice. You made every choice. And now we all have to live with it. She flinched at the sharpness of my words, and for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. Real fear. But I was too far gone to care. I marched to the front door, flinging it open. Get out, I said coldly. Take him and leave. Her eyes widened in shock. What? You can't. I don't want to see you right now, I said, my voice cold and final. If you stay here another second, I'll lose whatever control I have left. Do you understand? She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. But she knew there was nothing left to say. She turned away, wiping her tears, and scooped up our son from the living room floor. He looked up at her with curious eyes, unaware that his world was about to change forever. Please, she whispered one last time. Let's talk about this. But I slammed the door behind her. The sound of her sobs echoed through the walls as she walked away, her footsteps growing fainter with each step. And then there was silence. I collapsed on the couch, burying my face in my hands, and for the first time in years, I let myself cry. It wasn't the quiet, dignified kind of crying. It was raw, broken, the kind of crying that tears through your soul and leaves you gasping for air. I had lost everything. The woman I loved had betrayed me. The child I adored wasn't mine, and the life I had built, brick by brick, had crumbled into dust. For hours, I sat there, staring at nothing, trying to make sense of the wreckage. But there was no sense to be found. Just pain, just loss. As the night wore on, my thoughts began to shift. The anger simmered beneath the surface, waiting for its chance to ignite. I thought about the man, her lover, the one who had walked away and left me to pick up the pieces. I couldn't let it end like this. I needed answers. I needed closure. And more than anything, I needed to find him. The next morning, exhaustion wrapped around me like a noose, but anger kept me on my feet. Sleep had eluded me, replaced by endless thoughts of him, the man responsible for everything that went wrong. I had to find him. I couldn't let him walk away without consequences. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about answers. I needed to look into the eyes of the man who had taken what was mine, my family, my peace, my life, and see if he even cared. I needed to know how easily he walked away after shattering everything I held dear. The only clue I had was a conversation I overheard at work, the one that tipped me off in the first place. They mentioned that my wife's lover had left town when she got pregnant. I didn't have a name, but someone in the office knew. Someone had been keeping this secret, watching me live in ignorance, and I intended to wring every piece of information I could out of them. I threw on some clothes, ignoring the chaos in the living room. Broken furniture, shattered glass, and the remnants of last night's rage. There was no time to clean up. I didn't care. I grabbed my keys, slamming the door behind me as I headed to the one place that could provide the answers I needed, the office. When I arrived, the office was still half empty, the early morning hum of computers the only sound in the room. I spotted Rachel, the coworker I overheard gossiping with someone in the boss's office. She was sitting at her desk, typing away, unaware that I was closing in on her. I didn't have time for subtlety. I walked right up to her desk and leaned in close, forcing her to meet my gaze. "You're going to tell me everything," I whispered, my voice low and dangerous. Her fingers froze on the keyboard. What? What are you talking about?" I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to shout. "You know exactly what I mean. You and the others have been talking about me, about my son, about how he's not mine. I heard you." Rachel's face drained of color, panic flashing in her eyes. "I didn't mean—" I cut her off. "Tell me who he is. Who did my wife sleep with?" She swallowed hard, her hands shaking slightly as they hovered over her keyboard. "It's not what you think. Stop lying," I hissed, slamming my hand on the desk. "Just give me his name." Rachel looked around, terrified that someone might overhear us. When she realized no one was paying attention, she leaned in closer and whispered, "It was Albert Torrens." I froze. The name didn't ring a bell, but hearing it aloud made everything feel real. Too real. "Who the hell is Albert Torrens?" I demanded. "He used to work here," Rachel whispered. "But he left 2 years ago. When he found out your wife was pregnant, he disappeared, sold his stuff, quit his job, and vanished." My hands curled into fists, my knuckles turning white. "Where is he now?" Rachel glanced around again, as if the very mention of his name could summon him from thin air. "I don't know," she said nervously. "I swear. I heard he moved to some small village, but I don't know where. That was all I needed. A name, a trail, a destination." Without another word, I turned and left the office, ignoring Rachel's stammered protests behind me. I could hear the panic in her voice, but it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was finding Albert Torrens. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with thoughts of what I would do when I found him. I couldn't think clearly. Every scenario my mind conjured involved him suffering, begging for mercy, regretting the day he ever crossed my path. I couldn't stop myself from picturing it. When I got home, I didn't bother with explanations or goodbyes. I moved through the house like a man possessed, grabbing everything I thought I'd need: duct tape, a stun gun, gasoline, and the old chainsaw I kept in the garage. I wasn't sure what I was planning exactly, but it didn't matter. I just knew I had to be prepared for whatever came next. It took 2 days to track him down. I called in every favor I could think of. I even reached out to an old friend of mine who worked in law enforcement. He was hesitant at first, but after hearing what I'd been through, he agreed to help. "Albert Torrens," he muttered over the phone. "Yeah, I've heard that name. Give me a couple of hours, and I'll see what I can dig up." The wait felt like an eternity, but by the end of the day, I had what I needed. My friend sent me the address of a small, rundown house in a remote village about 4 hours away. Albert hadn't gone far. That was enough for me. I threw my gear into the trunk of my car and hit the road, my heart pounding with every mile that passed. The highway stretched out before me like a dark ribbon, the weight of everything pressing down on my chest. I thought about turning back, about abandoning the idea entirely, but every time I imagined his smug face, every time I thought of the 2 years he had stolen from me, my resolve hardened. There was no turning back now. When I arrived, the village was smaller than I expected. A handful of houses scattered across a winding dirt road, surrounded by trees and open fields. It felt eerily quiet, as if the world had forgotten this place existed. I parked a short distance away and began asking around. Most of the villagers were suspicious, unwilling to offer much information. But eventually, someone pointed me toward a wooden house at the edge of town. "That's Albert's place," an old man muttered. "But he's not exactly friendly." "Good," I muttered under my breath, heading toward the house with grim determination. I reached the house just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The windows were dark, the door locked tight. No sign of life. I decided to wait. I parked my car down the road and watched from a distance, my eyes fixed on the front door. Hours passed, but I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, waiting for him to show up. Finally, around midnight, a beat-up old pickup truck rumbled down the road and pulled into the driveway. I watched as a man climbed out, his movements sluggish, his head bowed. It was him, Albert Torrance, the man who had ruined everything. I stepped out of the car, heart pounding, and moved toward the house like a shadow. My mind was a blur of rage and adrenaline, my fists clenched at my sides. By the time he reached the front door, I was right behind him. "Albert," I called out, my voice cold and steady. He froze, turning slowly to face me. His eyes widened in recognition, and I saw the fear bloom across his face. Albert's eyes widened as I closed the distance between us, my footsteps deliberate, heavy with purpose. He stumbled back, fumbling for the keys in his hand, but it was too late. The rage I had carried for days, like a fire burning in my chest, finally ignited. I grabbed him by the collar and slammed him hard against the doorframe. His breath left him in a choked gasp, and for a brief moment, I felt a twisted satisfaction. This was the man who had shattered my world, made me doubt everything I believed in, and now he was standing in front of me, terrified and at my mercy. "You remember my wife, don't you?" I whispered, my voice cold and venomous. His eyes darted wildly, panic seeping into every feature of his face. "I don't know what you're talking about, man." Before he could finish the lie, I punched him in the gut. He doubled over, gasping for air, but I didn't give him a chance to recover. I shoved him through the door, sending him sprawling to the floor inside his dingy, unkempt house. The place reeked of stale beer and regret, the kind of place someone went to disappear from their mistakes. "Don't lie to me," I growled, standing over him. "You thought you could just walk away, didn't you? Knock her up, leave her with me, and disappear like none of it ever happened." He coughed, clutching his ribs, and tried to scramble away, but I grabbed him by the shirt and dragged him across the room, throwing him into a wooden chair. He landed with a grunt, and before he could move again, I was on him, duct tape in hand, wrapping it tightly around his wrists and ankles, binding him to the chair. His eyes went wide with fear. "Hey man, come on, we can talk about this." "Talk?" I sneered. "You had your chance to talk. Now it's my turn." I paced the small living room, my heart pounding, the anger simmering just beneath my skin. Every lie my wife told, every moment I had spent raising a child that wasn't mine, flashed through my mind like a slideshow of betrayal. The life I had built, the life I thought was mine, had been nothing more than a cruel illusion, and Albert was the man who had made it happen. "I want to know why," I said, my voice tight with barely contained fury. "Why did you leave? Why did you make me carry the weight of your mess?" Albert licked his lips nervously, his eyes flickering toward the door, calculating his chances of escape. "There were none. I didn't know she was pregnant," he stammered, his words rushed desperate. "It wasn't supposed to happen, okay? It was just a stupid fling. I didn't think she'd keep it. And by the time I found out," he hesitated, his voice cracking. "I panicked, man. I ran. I didn't know what else to do. I clenched my fists so tightly my knuckles turned white. A fling. That's what it was to him. Just a stupid mistake. something he could forget about, leave behind, while I spent 2 years living a lie. Do you have any idea what you've done to me? I whispered, my voice trembling with rage. Do you even care? He didn't answer. He just stared at me, his eyes full of fear, knowing that there was nothing he could say that would make this right. And that was when I realized he wasn't sorry. Not really. He had moved on. He had left the mess behind, and I was the idiot who had stayed to clean it up. The anger surged inside me, white-hot and uncontrollable. I grabbed the chainsaw from the corner of the room, the heavy weight of it familiar in my hands. Albert's eyes widened in terror as I revved the engine, the violent roar of the blade filling the small house. No, no, please, he begged, struggling against the duct tape that held him in place. But I didn't care. All I could see was the years of pain, the humiliation, the betrayal. I stepped toward him, the chainsaw growling in my hands, and for the first time in days, I felt a twisted sense of relief. This was how it would end. Just as I raised the chainsaw, ready to cut away the lies that had consumed my life, I heard the front door burst open behind me. Tom, stop! I turned, the chainsaw still rumbling in my hands, and saw my friend, Eric, standing in the doorway, his eyes wide with horror. He was panting, like he had run all the way from his car, and the look on his face told me everything. He knew what I was about to do. Put it down, Tom, he said, his voice steady but urgent. This isn't the way. You don't want to do this. I stood frozen, the chainsaw heavy in my hands, the roar of it drowning out the sound of my own heartbeat. For a moment I wavered. The anger still burned inside me, hot and all-consuming, but Eric's words cut through the haze. You've got a life ahead of you, he said, stepping closer, his hands raised in a calming gesture. Don't throw it away for this. I glanced down at Albert, tied to the chair, his face pale with terror. He wasn't worth it. Deep down I knew that. Killing him wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't undo the lies, wouldn't make the pain go away. All it would do was drag me deeper into the darkness. Eric reached me, slowly and carefully, and placed a hand on my shoulder. Let it go, man, he whispered. He's not worth it. The chainsaw slipped from my hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The engine sputtered and died, leaving behind an eerie silence. I stumbled back, my chest heaving, the weight of everything crashing down on me all at once. I had come so close to crossing a line I could never come back from. Eric guided me toward the door, his grip firm but gentle. Come on, he said quietly. Let's get you out of here. I cast one last glance at Albert, slumped in the chair, too terrified to speak. He wasn't worth it. None of this was. Outside, the night air hit me like a slap to the face, cold and sobering. I leaned against Eric's car, my legs shaking beneath me, and let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Eric was the same guy who gave me the information about where Albert lived. You were going to ruin your life for him, Eric said softly, leaning beside me. But it's not too late to walk away. I nodded, though the weight of everything still pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. The betrayal, the lies, the anger, they were all still there, but for the first time, I saw a way out. I didn't have to carry this rage anymore. I didn't have to let it consume me. Eric stayed by my side, not saying a word, just offering his presence, his friendship. And for the first time in days, I felt something other than anger. I felt exhausted. Eric drove me home that night, neither of us saying much along the way. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind. It was the kind that gave me space to process the gravity of what I had almost done. I kept replaying those moments in Albert's house in my mind. The rage, the helplessness, the wild satisfaction I felt holding that chainsaw. If Eric hadn't shown up, I wouldn't be sitting in that car right now. I'd be in the back of a police van, or worse. As the road stretched on, the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving only the dull ache of exhaustion behind. The anger was still there, but it had burned itself down to embers, leaving behind nothing but a hollow emptiness. When we pulled into my driveway, Eric turned off the engine and looked at me, his expression serious but kind. You need to figure out what comes next, he said quietly, before it eats you alive. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what that meant yet. Thanks for stopping me. I muttered, my voice raw. Eric gave me a small, understanding smile. That's what friends are for. The house felt different when I stepped inside. Colder, emptier, as if the damage I had done to my life had seeped into the walls. The shattered TV sat in the corner like a monument to my rage. The broken furniture scattered across the room, a reminder of how far I had unraveled. But the real mess wasn't the things I had destroyed. The real wreckage was inside me. I stood in the living room for a long time, staring at the destruction. Part of me wanted to pick up the pieces, to try and make things look normal again. But another part knew that nothing would ever be the same. Not really. I sat down on the edge of the couch, my head in my hands, and tried to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. My wife was gone, taking her son, with her. I had no idea where she was, and honestly, I didn't care. I just knew that whatever future we might have shared was gone. The life I thought I had been building was over. The next few days passed in a blur. I didn't go to work. I barely left the house. I ignored my phone, knowing there would be messages from my wife, pleading, apologizing, or maybe just checking in to see if I'd come to my senses. I wasn't ready to hear any of it. Instead, I threw myself into cleaning up the mess I'd made. I picked up the broken TV, swept the shattered glass into a dustpan, and straightened the furniture as best as I could. It was a slow, painful process, but with every piece I put back in its place, I felt a tiny bit more in control, like I was rebuilding myself one small step at a time. But the silence was the hardest part. There were no bedtime stories, no giggles from the child I had loved as my own. Every time I walked past his empty room, the ache in my chest deepened. He wasn't mine, but that didn't stop me from missing him. It didn't stop me from loving him. That was the cruelest part of all. On the third day, Eric stopped by unannounced. I let him in without a word, grateful for his presence even though I didn't have the energy to say so. He took one look at the cleaned-up living room and gave a small nod of approval, as if to say, this is a start. He sat down at the kitchen table, cracking open a couple of beers he had brought with him, and slid one across the table to me. So, he said, taking a sip, what's the plan? I stared at the beer for a long time before answering. I don't know. Eric gave me a patient look. You need to figure it out, man. The way I see it, you've got two choices. You either let this thing break you, or you figure out how to move forward. Move forward? I scoffed. How the hell am I supposed to do that? Eric shrugged. You start by forgiving yourself. For what happened? For what almost happened? I let out a bitter laugh. Easier said than done. Yeah, Eric agreed. But it's the only way. That night, after Eric left, I sat alone in the quiet house and tried to make sense of what he had said. Forgive myself. It sounded impossible, but maybe he was right. Maybe the only way out of this mess was through it. I reached for my phone, finally working up the courage to check the messages I had been ignoring. There were several from my wife, each one more desperate than the last. She wanted to talk. She wanted to explain. I wasn't sure I was ready for that conversation, but there was one thing I needed to do, something I had been avoiding since the moment I opened that DNA test. I needed to let go. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the first step. I packed a small bag, grabbed my car keys, and drove to the hotel where my wife had been staying. She opened the door, her eyes red and swollen from days of crying. The child, our child, sat quietly on the bed, playing with a toy car. When he saw me, his face lit up with a smile that shattered my heart all over again. Hi, buddy, I whispered, crouching down to his level. He toddled over to me, wrapping his little arms around my neck in a hug that I didn't deserve but needed more than anything. I held him tightly, closing my eyes against the tears that threatened to spill. When I finally pulled away, I stood up and faced my wife. She looked at me with a mixture of hope and fear, as if she wasn't sure what I was going to say next. I'm not here to fight, I said quietly. I just needed to say goodbye. Her face crumpled, and she covered her mouth with her hand, stifling a sob. But I didn't waver. I don't know what the future looks like, I admitted. But I know I can't live like this, angry, broken, holding on to something that isn't real. I need to let go. For both of us? She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. And for the first time in a long time, I saw something in her eyes that looked like regret. Take care of him, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. He deserves better than this. She nodded again, unable to speak, and I gave our son one last hug before turning to leave. As I drove away from the hotel, a strange sense of relief washed over me. It wasn't closure, not entirely, but it was the beginning of something new. A life without lies. A life without anger. A life that I would build on my own, brick by brick. I didn't know where the road would take me, but for the first time in a long time, as I drove away from the hotel, the world outside my windshield felt hazy and surreal. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and my thoughts spun like a storm. Grief, anger, and a strange, reluctant relief blending into something I couldn't fully name. I had done what I needed to do, but instead of peace, all I felt was the weight of everything I was leaving behind. The child I raised, the woman I loved, the life I thought was mine. I pulled over on a deserted stretch of road and shut off the engine, breathing heavily as if I'd just run a marathon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, but it didn't feel beautiful. It felt like the last flicker of something dying. For 2 years, I had built my world around that boy. His laughter, his tiny hands gripping my finger, the way he'd fall asleep against my chest. I thought I could walk away, that saying goodbye would be enough. But it wasn't. I slammed my fist into the steering wheel, frustration bubbling to the surface again. It would have been easier if I hated the child, if every moment with him had felt like a lie, like poison running through my veins. But it didn't. That was the cruelest part. I loved him. I still did. And now I had to live with the knowledge that those feelings didn't matter, because in the end, biology had robbed me of the right to stay. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath, but all I could see was the look on his face when he hugged me in the hotel room. He didn't understand. He didn't know that the world he trusted had shattered beneath his feet. To him, I was still his father, still the man who would protect him no matter what. And now I had left him behind. For a fleeting moment, I considered going back. Driving to the hotel, picking him up, and telling my wife that it didn't matter what the DNA test said. He was still mine. But I knew better. If I stayed, that boy would grow up in the shadow of a broken marriage, trapped between parents poisoned by distrust and regret. He deserved more than that. He deserved a father who wouldn't crumble every time he saw the ghost of betrayal reflected in his own son's eyes. Letting go was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was also the right thing. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. I stayed on the side of the road for a long time, staring into the fading light. Slowly, painfully, the rage inside me began to shrink, folding in on itself like a dying flame. It didn't disappear entirely. Anger that deep never does, but it no longer felt like it owned me. And with that realization came something strange, the tiniest flicker of hope. I could start over. The man I was, the husband, the father, was gone, but I wasn't. There was still a future waiting for me somewhere beyond this wreckage. Maybe not a perfect one, but a future nonetheless. I started the engine and headed toward the one person who had been my lifeline through all of this. Later that night, Eric's front door opened before I could knock. He stood there with a beer in hand, as if he knew I'd be coming. "You look like hell," he said with a grin. I chuckled for the first time in what felt like years. "Feel like it too." He stepped aside, letting me in without any questions. That was the thing about Eric, he didn't need to pry. He knew the war I was fighting inside myself, and he knew the only thing I needed right now was space to breathe. We sat on his porch, staring into the quiet night, the sound of crickets filling the gaps between our words. He handed me a beer, and for a moment, we just sat there in comfortable silence. I let them go. I finally whispered, the words tasting strange on my tongue. I said goodbye. Eric didn't say anything at first. He just nodded, taking a long sip of his beer. "That couldn't have been easy." "No," I murmured. "It wasn't." We sat there for a while longer, the silence settling between us like an old friend. For the first time, it didn't feel unbearable. It felt manageable. The morning after, I woke up on Eric's couch, a blanket thrown haphazardly over me. My head throbbed, but it wasn't the usual kind of pain. It was the ache that comes with finally facing the truth, the exhaustion of a storm that's passed. And for the first time in weeks, I felt lighter. I knew there would be more hard days ahead. The memories would haunt me, and the pain would never fully leave. But I also knew that I could survive it. One day at a time. Eric was already in the kitchen when I shuffled in, brewing coffee like it was just another ordinary morning. "What's next?" he asked over his shoulder, pouring me a cup. I shrugged, taking the coffee gratefully. "I don't know, but I think I'll figure it out." He grinned. "That's a start, a glimpse of tomorrow." A few weeks later, I found a small apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with mismatched furniture and noisy neighbors. But it was mine. For the first time in a long time, I had something that belonged solely to me. The days passed slowly, but each one felt a little easier than the last. I started going to the gym again, picked up an old hobby I'd forgotten about, and even found a job that didn't make me hate the mornings. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was a life. And that was enough. The final lesson. Every now and then, I thought about them, my wife, the boy I once called my son. I wondered if he still remembered me, if he missed the bedtime stories and the games we used to play. It hurt to think about, but that's the thing about pain. It doesn't stay sharp forever. Eventually, it dulls into something you can carry without breaking under the weight. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean erasing what had happened. It just meant choosing not to let the past define the rest of my life. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.